Hello audience. In this audio article, I am going to discuss an editorial which was published in Mint in the Mumbai edition on 18th of March 2023. Its headline is An Englishman in Jahangir's Court. Nandini Das narrates an important encounter, the arrival of Thomas Roe in the Mughal court in 17th century. Here it begins. In 1589, Richard Hakluyt printed a Samuel collection of all the English travel writings of his time, titled The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics and Discoveries of the English Nation. He had done so. He confessed to the counter the insulting notion in Europe that the English were inferior and largely naval explorers. His vaguely tome and the advice he offered to trading companies galvanized seafaring activity. And according to academic and author Nandini Das, trading companies galvanized seafaring activities, and according to the academic author Nandini Das, is the foundation on which the Britain view of itself as a heroic safeguarding nation would be established for centuries to come. This energizing fervor was well timed, for after incommunication of Elizabeth I by Pope Pius V in 1570, the English were struggling to trade with Catholic Europe and were desperate to discover new markets. In the trade winds of these reinventions, we find Thomas Roe in 1615 setting off his 4-year mission as English ambassador to the court of the Mughal emperor in India in Jahangir. In her sumptuous new book, Courting India, England, Mughal India and the Origins of Empire, Das walks us through the dark wood-panelled rooms, gunmetal schemes and corruption of Jacobean England, into the wide courtyards and light-filled spaces of Mughal India, where Roe confronted by a world that is both familiar and deeply unsettling. For foreign, Roe carried with him a precious English coach, a marvel of engineering and style in Europe, as a gift to the Mughal emperor, and the fate of his coach is almost caricatural. In the loaded symbolism it represents of the fears that poisoned the early English encounters with Mughal India. The coach was esteemed as a gift among the royal houses of Europe, but the governor of Surat, where Roe's ships docked, reached startlingly, he scorned it and said it was little and poor. Wrote a mortified Roe, who would have noted its tarnished condition after the long sea voyages in the harsh light of India. By the end of the year, Roe would note bitterly that the English coachmen who had been made to parade the coach for fatiguingly before Jahangir had instead been recruited into the emperor's service, seamlessly parading in full Mughal customs. It was not long before Jahangir has copies made of the English coach, now upholstered in gorgeous Persian velvet instead of the inferior Chinese one of the origin. The English coach and the coachman had been authored and administered, assimilated and morphed into a different alien thing. As we read of Roe's high-stakes struggles to scrape together suitable gifts for the Mughal courtiers, there is a faint but disquality shiver for foreboding. For by the time of Governor-General Warren Hastings, little more than 150 years later, it was Indian rulers who were sending him staggeringly large diamonds and furniture in pure ivory, and it was Hastings who was bestowing miniature painting to himself on local Nawabs, like a monarch himself, much like James I was doing in the time of Roe. The genesis of those centuries of empire in India was taking place exactly at this modern moment, with Roe in his nation, in his satin doubled feathered cap and mean gifts. Thus, a professor of early modern literature and culture is able to place Roe with exquisite finesse within the culture and time. In one famous anecdote, Jahangir is able to have one of Ro's miniature painting copied perfectly by his master painters, so that Ro struggles to identify the original. In his journals, Ro notes that Jahangir was so delighted that he was very merry and joyful and cracked like a northern man. To crackle, explained thus, means to boast or to jest, and when upset, used by Ro, betrays the fact that despite aligning strangers, he always experienced he was that ejaculating as visceral level to this joyous bonhomie, recognizing a universal human condition, and this image of a clothing merry emperor will stay with the leader too. Indeed, Ro is soon caught up in Jahangir's magnetic force field, following him like a gigantic creature that only could command. When Jahangir leaves Ajmer, Ro has to follow, usually suffering from bloody dysentery and exaggerating piles. As his health fails, his wanderings become miserable and he cannot join the drinking parties for their waters of fire. He confesses, perhaps it is inevitable that like Ro, and perhaps thus herself, the reader too is seduced by the personality of Jahangir and the intrigues, scandals and machinations in his court. And if there is to be any criticism of his book, it is that Ro is somewhat textually and literally relented to the margins. Ro's diary can be seemed pedestrian, the mean fatly shackled by his deep-rooted anxieties and petty obsessions about the fear of assassination, or translation, inevitably viewing the Mughal world through a fine haze of prejudice. He underestimates Noor Jahan's power, invisible as she is, misunderstands courtesy exchange, having refused to learn any local language, his bibulous companies and embarrassing brutal foul-mouthed and violent. One of the most interesting sections is the reaction of English travelers shaped by the sectarian conflicts of their own nation to the capacious religious permissiveness of Mughal India. So while Ro is amazed that non-Muslims are allowed to the freedom to trade, for Chaplin and author Edward Terry, eternally curious, there is much to admire in both the Hindu and Muslim devotion to regular prayer and adherence to ancestral customs. His own fellow Englishmen, he admits, were only neglectedly Christians. So ordinary Indians in Surat judged them harshly and said, Christians much do wrong, much beat, much abuse others. Perhaps the most startling example of the accelerating polyglot Thomas Cordiat shouting out in response to Muezzin's call to prayer the following undoubtedly linguistically nibble but offensive ditty: La la li la la, Hashrat Isha Billah. It was an Islamic chant to claim there is no God but one God, and the Lord Christ and Son of God. Cordiat had to admit that a Christian can speak much more freely than he can in any other Manhattan country in the world, or indeed in any Christian country. For so long, the Mughal Empire has been viewed as from a wrong end of the telescope, diminished and demeaned because it was narrated primarily through the prejudice of later British conquerors. It appeared ragged and improvised. Its decline is fatal inevitably. In country India, thus recreates with elegance and delicacy the time when it is far overshadowed that distant Waterloo Island in culture and in wealth, a time in which the English and their prickly ambassador were but an unremarkable blip in their story. On the Ro finally left the Mughal court, Jahangir notes in his diary that the sour-screen pair he has been studying were good parents. The departure of Ro, writes, thus goes unremarked.